This video is going to show you how to convert decimals to fractions and fractions to decimals. And before we start off converting, I have this visual sort of drawn out here that I have prepared, and I want to just kind of review exactly what decimals are and exactly what fractions are. So we know that we've seen this before. We know that anything that comes in front of or before that decimal point are whole numbers. So the place right in front of the decimal point would be the ones place. Just regular old whole number ones. So like the number 3, for example, right, would go here. Okay, we also know that if I take one of those ones, so for example, like the picture that I have drawn below, I have one orange square. That represents our whole in this visual, in this picture. So I have one square, and if I were to take that one and split it up into 10 parts, if I just looked at one of those parts, that would be a tenth. And I'm going to write it as the tenths place with a TH. So remember, that's different than tens. This is saying if I take one whole and I split it up into 10 parts and I look at one of those 10 parts, that is the tenths. And that's the place that is right next to the decimal point on the other side. If I go one more place over with decimals, that is like saying I'm taking my whole one, I'm taking my big orange square, my whole one, and I'm splitting it up into 100 parts. So 10 rows across, 10 on the bottom. And I'm splitting that up into 100 parts. If I look at one of those parts, that's 1/100th. So that is the hundredths place, also with a TH. Hundredths with a TH. So if you remember that as the visual here, that'll help you remember the place right next to the decimal. On the right side of the decimal is the tenths place. The place that's 2 over from the decimal is the hundredths place. That's like saying 1 part out of 100. This one is like saying 1 part out of 10. And this is just saying the whole number 1. Okay, so we are going to use that to actually convert decimals to fractions and vice versa. So let's first start with if we are given a fraction. So let's say you're looking at the fraction 43 hundredths, 43 out of 100. Well, just a second ago we discussed that the hundredths place is 1 out of 100, and the way that it's written is 0.01 or 1/100th. So if I'm looking at 43 hundredths, I know that my decimal has to go out 2 places after the decimal, because this is the hundredths place. So 43 over 100 would be written like this as a decimal, 43 hundredths. What if you just had something like 9 hundredths? If I have 9 out of 100 parts of one whole, if I have 9 out of 100, that'd be like having 9 of those little orange squares on the very right. That'd be like having 9 of them colored in. So think about if that would go in the tenths place or in the hundredths place. If I have 9 out of 100, that 9 is going to go in the hundredths place. Let's look at some different examples. Let's say we had 3/10. All right, this is 3 parts out of 10. So I know if I'm considering my one whole orange square, if I'm considering 3 of those parts out of 10 parts, look at my denominator. I know that my denominator means that I'm in the tenths place. So this would be written as 3/10 like that, 0.3, 3/10. Same thing with something like 7/10. If I have 7 out of 10 parts, the digit 7 has to be in the tenths place. So that's like saying 7/10 written as 0.7. Another good way to check yourself is if you say that decimal and it sounds like the fraction, they actually have the same name. So 7/10 is the same as 7/10. It's always a good way to check yourself. All right, something I want to talk about is what would happen. It seems like it's pretty easy to tell what your fraction is going to be when it's written as a decimal if it has a denominator of either 10 or 100. But what would happen if your fraction was something like 4/5? And I asked you, how would you write that as a decimal? Well, if you know how to write fractions as a decimal that have a 10 or a 100 in the denominator, then you should be able to take that fraction and make it have a 10 or a 10 or a 100 in the denominator. So for example, I know how to make equivalent fractions. I know that I can multiply the top number and the bottom number by the same thing. If I wanted to make this fraction have a denominator of 10, I could multiply 5 times 2 to get 10. But I multiplied the denominator by 2, so I also have to multiply the numerator by 2. 4 times 2 I know is 8. So I know for sure that 4/5 is equivalent to 8/10. And I also know how to write 8/10 as a decimal. It has an 8, the digit 8, in the tens place, which means that 4/5 written as a decimal is 8/10.